Bienvenido.
Welcome, it's great to see you back. We are going to begin with this seminar. Once again, we have simultaneous interpretation for all of our events. If you need an interpretation device, please make sure to ask for one at the door. We're going to now begin with our next seminar, Ensuring Citizen Security Strategy for Safer Societies. In order to boost growth in Latin America and the Caribbean, it is absolutely important and vital to ensure that there is better public safety and administration of justice. We have experts who are going to be discussing the ways in which crime and violence manifest in our societies. All of this is exacerbated by the influence and growing powers in organized crime. We're going to have evidence-based discussions and discuss how the different approaches are taking on these complex challenges. We will now welcome our panelists for this seminar. We would like to ask Mark Shaw, Director of the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime, to join us on the stage, and ask that you please give them a round of applause.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for the invitation to speak, and it's really a pleasure to be here. On the available data, parts of Latin America and the Caribbean are some of the most criminally violent places on earth. And there are other countries with such high levels of violence, my own, South Africa, for example, but your region has experienced consistently high levels of violence across multiple countries. And a significant share of that violence arguably is connected directly or indirectly to organized crime. And when people talk about organized crime or see it in popular culture, they often think of drugs and the often extraordinary levels of violence associated with criminal gangs. And that's for good reason. In many countries, not least in this region, homicides connected to organized crime in what you may call concentrations of violence kill more people than armed conflict. But the harms caused by organized crime are considerably more widespread, and increasingly so than just from drug markets and the depressingly high level of violence. And organized crime threatens peace and security itself, as we have seen recently in Haiti and Ecuador. It destroys the environment, it corrodes governance and institutional integrity, it undermines the rule of law, it violates human rights, and it perpetuates corruption. It endangers health, welfare, and it tears the social fabric of societies. And all of these points combined together undermine development. So in short, organized crime affects lives, livelihoods, life chances, and it's one of the biggest impediments to the stated goal of the IDB, which is to improve lives. In 2016, we began an undertaking to measure the extent and harms caused by organized crime across the globe. And it has been a challenging exercise in which there has been really a lot of investment. The result is the Global Index Against Transnational Organized Crime, which measures the level and impact of organized crime in all 193 member states of the UN. And I'll show you some of the results for Latin America. As you can see on the left-hand side of the slide, Latin America and the Caribbean, although there's quite a lot of variety amongst different states, score above the global average for several criminal markets. The most pervasive is cocaine, perhaps unsurprisingly, which is well above the global average. But while drugs get a lot of attention, regionally arms trafficking, human trafficking, counterfeit goods, extortion, and racketeering are all above the global average. And smuggling of migrants is a fast-growing market which remains largely understudied in some parts of the region. So there's a diverse set of criminal markets in Latin America and the Caribbean that deserve attention. And indeed, I would argue that one of the reasons for the IDB to be involved is that organized crime affects Latin America and the Caribbean disproportionately, and this will continue to be the case. Significantly, however, not only is there high criminality, but resilience to illicit economies in the region is also relatively low, although I want to emphasize that resilience varies significantly amongst different states. And by resilience, I mean the types of mechanisms that countries have in place to combat organized crime, and more importantly, the effectiveness of those mechanisms. And you can see on the slide here, Latin America and the Caribbean is below the global average in 3/4 of the resilience indicators or index measures of the Global Organized Crime Index. The biggest deficit between your region and the rest of the world relates to judicial systems and detention. And in particular, prisons in this region are a bleeding sore from which the bacteria of organized crime spreads. And the data shows that. And although prevention and non-state actors may be higher than the global average in Latin America and the Caribbean, you can still see that those scores are low and they are falling. In many states in the region, civil society fills the vacuum left by the state, and activists and journalists and NGOs are standing up to criminal groups. They often pay with their lives. Because of the actions of organized crime, the region is one of the most dangerous places in the world to be a human rights activist or an environmental defender. But organized crime also negatively touches the lives of every single one of the region's citizens, and often in ways that they do not recognize. So what can be done by development actors like the bank and of course yourselves? And I want to suggest that there are no quick and easy solutions, but the situation is not by any means hopeless. And I would like to suggest 5 priority actions. First, be better informed. Second, invest in resilience and build integrity. Third, engage a wide range of stakeholders. Fourth, be more strategic. And fifth, anticipate and provide early warning. And with your permission, I'll quickly elaborate on each of these areas. First, be better informed. We need to sharpen our tools for measuring organized crime and its impact across multiple markets, and in particular new markets. At the moment, data collection on illicit markets, as well as reporting across jurisdictions and government organizations, is often rudimentary and fragmented. There's an over-reliance on government statistics, official government statistics, particularly seizures, and on some markets, we have almost no data. And many of you may feel that the problem has been over-analyzed already. Certainly there's a lot of discussion about organized crime in the region, or that analysis has no impact. But I want to suggest that given the rapid expansion of illicit markets, there's now little alternative in this region and others to assemble, standardize, and analyze data within and across markets and territories. And there's now a massive opportunity for doing this through increased experimentation and innovation in markets like the environment, around criminal governance, and many more. We have more tools at our disposal than we've ever had, and we need to act fast. Independent and reliable data beyond standard criminal justice statistics is absolutely imperative. Even more so is the requirement to make sure that data and analysis gets to the right decision makers. The second area where we need more work is to invest in resilience and build integrity, something that an institution like the IDB has been doing and could do more. Organized crime is often as much a symptom of socioeconomic failure as its cause. It preys on pockets of poverty and the lack of state presence, deepening social exclusion. And that means reducing inequality that enables criminal markets to flourish. It also means addressing impunity within the rule of law to show that states can act. Left unchecked, organized crime erodes and corrupts institutions where they are present, and it weakens governance and service delivery. Organized crime is intimately intertwined with corruption. Strengthening integrity in public administration and business remains an essential objective. Investing in resilience can also strengthen institutional capacities, not least for criminal justice. And take the example of prisons, the big challenge of this region, in my opinion. Too often, prisons become places where petty criminals are recruited by more hardened ones, gang culture is strengthened, illicit deals are struck, and criminal operations are carried out. And ironically, that's a cycle that promotes criminality rather than eroding it. So we need to look in this sector to sustainable solutions, incorporating restorative justice paradigms by rehabilitating and reincorporating young people into communities, giving them a chance to contribute. Arresting people is definitely one solution, but it is not the only one. And it's vital to support prison reform and alternatives to imprisonment. But it's also vital to support community development, education, empowerment of community leaders, and many more actions that build local resilience. Ladies and gentlemen, my third point is the need to engage a wider range of stakeholders. Organized crime is everybody's problem, and there needs to be a whole of society approach to address it. In addition to law enforcement and development actors, it is essential to engage with civil society, the private sector, youth, and government at all levels. And concerning the private sector, we have to change the commonly held perception of organized crime being part of a murky underworld. And in many cases, the private sector is a key enabler of illicit economies. And think tech and IT platforms, shipping and haulage companies, financial services, notaries, real estate agents, and lawyers, to name a few. And more needs to be done to make the private sector aware of its vulnerabilities, but also aware of its responsibilities in dealing with organized crime. Special attention in this region and elsewhere has to be paid to the youth. Young people between the ages of 15 to 29, and often young people very much younger than that, are commonly both victims and perpetrators of violence, which is connected to organized crime. And we need to keep young people off the escalator of crime to save lives and dry up the pools of recruits for organized crime. To do so is to make a critical investment in the future of this region. My fourth point is to be more strategic. And efforts to fight organized crime are often reactive, disjointed, and ad hoc. National and regional strategies can foster the type of holistic approaches that I have been describing. And such strategies can provide a common framework for deciding what should be done and how it should be resourced. But they also need clear leadership and commitment from political actors. One review has shown that countries with comprehensive strategies against organized crime are much more likely in the longer term to be able to build resilience to the phenomenon. And at the Global Initiative, we have completed a global strategy against organized crime, which we hope to release for debate in the coming weeks. My fifth and final point is the need to anticipate and to provide early warning. And a better pool of information and analytics, as I've already suggested, can help to assess and mitigate risks and enable remedial or preventive action. And if you take a look at this slide from the Global Organized Crime Index, which shows the widest spread between a set of countries between the sweep of the index in 2020 and the sweep in 2022. Ecuador stands out as the country where there was the greatest division between criminality and resilience. So the risk was growing substantially. And trends like that should have set alarm bells ringing. And in future, I think if we get it right, such information can be used to provide early warning and red flagging. Greater investment is required in prevention at an early stage to close the gap between risk and resilience. Ladies and gentlemen, to conclude, organized crime is the opposite of development. And therefore, development actors, including banks like the IDB, are major stakeholders in drying up illicit economies. And for years, your region has grappled with the pervasive violence of growing and evolving criminality. But from my own experience of working in the region, it also boasts some of the most inspiring examples of community resilience. And we have supported projects across the region, empowering local communities to stand up to organized crime. And I want to ask you to recognize here the crucial importance of building resilience to organized crime in creating and improving strategies to better people's lives. We can't always eliminate the threat entirely, but as development actors, we can build greater resilience to it. And regional cooperation is paramount. And I have no doubt that the influence of the people in this room can make a huge difference in this sector. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mark. What an interesting presentation. I mean, as we know, crime and violence significantly affects development prospects in our region of Latin America and the Caribbean. And that's why over the past 15 years, we at the InterAmerican Development Bank have been committed to supporting our member countries in the improvement of citizen security and justice policies. We've built expertise in this area, including with our colleague who will join us in this conversation, Natalia Alvarado, at the end. And it's a key, I think we have an important role to play also in informing other multilateral development banks and working with other multilateral agencies in responding to this threat. But as crime evolves, as the challenge of crime evolves, so too do the responses and the support that we need to provide at the IDB. As Mark was pointing out, organized crime is becoming a bigger and bigger problem. And so the UNODC 2023 Global Study on Homicides shows that in the Americas, organized crime is linked to half of homicides. I certainly didn't know that before I began to prepare for this panel. But the issue is beyond homicides. In public opinion surveys, people themselves are perceiving criminal organizations as a threat to their daily lives and their communities. So addressing this complex issue of organized crime while focusing on the broader spectrum of crime and violence, including violence against women, children, and other criminal acts, really demands a deep commitment from both countries and the global development community and global institutions like the Inter-American Development Bank. Obviously, we've heard about the importance of strengthening prevention, so I hope we'll hear a little bit more from our panelists about that issue. And it is at the core of our strategy, but we also need to deal with some of these other agencies and institutions that are not helping to improve the situation and where we can do more. And as Mr. Shaw noted, forging partnerships with all the stakeholders here and with our country partners is totally vital. So we have an incredible set of panelists today. Each one of them has a personal practitioner experience. We have one former police officer on our panel who later became a PhD that is working to develop evidence. We have an IMF economist that's looking at the issues from a macro standpoint. How is crime and violence affecting development and macroeconomic stability? We have our colleague who's the head of public security in the city of Cali, Colombia, at the very front. You know, he's working on this day to day. While we were backstage, someone was calling him to do some work right ahead of time. We have Vasilios Krasakopoulos, who joins us from FinTrack Canada, which is a very interesting organization that's looking at data on financial transactions and identifying risky activities and working with law enforcement, and then Natalie Alvarado, who is our keeper of the flame here inside. So let's start with the IMF, with Rafael Espinosa. You just did a really interesting study. The data was included in the Regional Economic Outlook of the Western Hemisphere at the IMF. Can you tell us a little bit about what you found in your study, what the effects are of crime and violence on macro stability?
Thank you very much, Amanda, for enabling this discussion on crime and violence and inviting the IMF to participate. As you mentioned, the partnerships are really important to us as well. We have heard from Mark how crime is an important topic for Latin America, that it actually tops the opinion surveys as the most important issue in many of our countries that we're covering in the region. And even when we look at the worst type of crime, homicides, there are the statistics floating that Latin America is home of only 1/10 of the world population, but it's the home of 1/3 of the homicides in the world. So really, it's no surprise that it's the top of the mind of the population we are serving. This is happening despite declines in poverty, declines in inequality, some improvements in social safety nets. So from an economic standpoint of view and development point of view, it's an important development that we have to look at. And what we did in the IMF report you mentioned was to make the link with the macroeconomic outcomes, since that's really our comparative advantage at the IMF, that's our area of expertise. We want to see the extent to which crime was an issue for economic outcomes. The report found that reducing crime in Latin America to levels comparable with the rest of the world would have really very large development impacts, with GDP increasing, let's say, by 10% of GDP in 10 years. This is really important to give an order of magnitude compared to other development policies. It's the equivalent of raising public investment by about 2% of GDP every year. It's the equivalent of increasing years of schooling for the whole population by 2 full years. So these are, very substantial development outcomes. And of course, there will be differences across countries and uncertainty around the estimates, but the magnitude is telling. Now, it's also worthwhile understanding a bit the channels via which crime is important for the macroeconomy. We tend in the literature to distinguish between the direct cost of crime and the indirect cost of crime. The direct cost of crime are straightforward. There is the victims themselves who suffer losses. There are firms who have to spend in security services. We know from surveys on the Caribbean region, for instance, that about 70% of firms have to spend on private security services. This costs them 4% of their sales. And despite this investment, this spending on security, they still lose about 3% of their sales to theft and other forms of crime. So obviously, this is going to have an impact on firms and the economic activity. There are also direct costs from society. The government has to spend on the security system, the judiciary, the prison system. So overall, the sum of these costs have been assessed to 1.5% of GDP to 2.5% of GDP in IDB studies. On top of that, there are the indirect channels, and the indirect channels are more dynamic. To take an example with firms, I was mentioning firms have to may do less investment because they spend on other things. They may exit areas of violence, and we find it in the macroeconomic data we look with countries with more violence having less capital stocks and less productivity. Households as well are affected. Just to give an example, we know that infants who are born in violent areas develop worse health outcomes, and their human capital in the long run is also affected. So to summarize, these are really very important macroeconomic results, consequence of crime, and organizations like ours are looking into that, given the importance of it, and trying to develop our knowledge in these areas.
Yeah, I think the scale of the macroeconomic impact is quite remarkable. I mean, and also violence in sending communities also drives migration. So I think that's another pressure that we're witnessing here in our region. Now we're going to go to Renee Mitchell. She is with the American Society of Evidencebased. We at the IDB, I think we've done, I'm new to the IDB, and I must say I was impressed by the use of evidence in this program. They're doing randomized control trials, they're doing quasi-experimental approaches to see what works. Tell us a little bit about your experience in introducing evidence-based policing in the United States.
So with evidence-based policing, wherever we go, when we're trying to work with a police department, it's a little bit of, I would say the first step is like unpacking the problem. So we know that there's evidence out there that we show like hotspot policing is effective at reducing crime and reducing calls for service. Focused deterrence, for example, for violence, organized crime, gangs is another approach. But you have to take the evidence of like what we know or have research support for and then apply it in the field. And that's the difficult part in the beginning. So you can't just take evidence off the shelf and apply it to your organization. Often you have to figure out like, what is the actual problem? And not just the crime problem, but also a lot of times when you're implementing a research project or a program in an organization, you find that there's challenges in your way. So you have to figure out, like with that organization, what works best for them. So I always explain when I work with police departments, I'm not coming in to tell you like how to do things. What I'm trying to do is figure out what the problem is in the community, and then how you're addressing it now, and then how to shape an intervention that we can actually track to see if it works. And I think the biggest thing, and we still fail in the US and even in other countries. I think the UK and New Zealand and Australia are probably the best when it comes to actually implementing evidence-based policing and tracking it, is we'll do a project or a program, and then once the study ends and we find our evidence, then we don't continue it. And I see evidence-based policing as being more of a continuous feedback loop, where you should be implementing a program and then looking at your data, seeing how it works, and then fixing things internally, and then working at them again. So you're constantly doing this. And I think what we're gonna get to is, policing is often reactive, right? We have to put out a fire, we have to deal with, if organized crime is blowing up, we gotta figure out like the immediate solutions to those problems. The way the evidence base should be incorporated into an organization is that you build a framework and a structure for it. So that way you could do the immediate, but then you also have some long-term strategic planning that you're investing in. Because over time, as we all know, if you let crime get out of control, you're gonna have economic impacts. It's going to impact your development. We're seeing it in the US, where we've scaled back some of our policing, and now we have economic outcomes because of it. And also, besides building the framework for policing, it has to be built into the prosecution office, into the prisons, and into probation and parole. It's gotta be the whole spectrum. It can't be just the police, and it's gotta be the community involvement as well.
So a system approach and applying the evidence in an iterative way.
Yep.
I think it's a long-term process. Ahora pasamos a Jairo García Guerrero, que es el secretario de Seguridad Ciudadana.
From Cali. He is Deputy Minister for Strategy and Planning. What can local governments do to address this challenge? First, as Secretary for Security and Justice in Cali, is key. Justice is key in order to exercise local security measures. The difference between working at the national and at the local levels is that when you look at your pulse using your smartwatch and when you touch your pulse, it's a very different thing, a very different experience. At the local level, we need to listen, understand, and take action. When it comes to organized crime in our cities and municipalities, we're not speaking of extortion. We are talking about what extortion does to a community. It breaks the trust between that community and the state. When the state cannot guarantee the community's security, when their economic security does not depend on themselves or the state, but rather a third party that wants to take over those resources. Violence breaks the social fabric. We're not just looking at numbers. We're not obsessed with numbers. We're speaking of individuals who are victims, the children, the parents, people who lose their lives because they're assassinated in a way that does harm to society. So our cities, our municipios face two major challenges. And I would invite you to make sure that we address the conversation with local entities differently. We need to look at criminal governance. We cannot in any way allow for criminals to make us believe that we should accept a situation where a third party is deciding how our communities live and how safe they're going to be. We're going to speak of Colombia, of Ecuador, Cali, but that criminal governance cannot, or that control cannot prevent us from having these difficult conversations. We need to work with the communities and have these difficult conversations, because it's hard when a community says, what you're doing isn't working. So we need to be institutionally resilient. That is what Mark was saying. There is nothing more important than institutional resilience. Especially in this sector, we need to harness all the arguments and all possible actions to find a way to recover that capacity. Cali is an extraordinary city, and we have seen that our citizen security and justice policy has been given the necessary budgetary support. We work day to day on the streets solving disputes, and we also have difficult conversations with the prosecutor's office and others to see how we can reduce the potential for organized crime to exist. We are fully convinced that the citizen security and justice policy has to start with a local approach and then move to the national level. And it's time for these difficult conversations, starting at the grassroots level, speaking with the communities and looking at how we can change the situation on the ground day by day. So you've said it, it's citizen security and justice. That is the title.
Canada. Obviously, identifying and disrupting the illicit financial flows that are associated with organized crime is a really important tool that we have, but also using that data to take action. Tell us a little bit about the work of FinTrack. What have you achieved? What are the innovations in this area? What would you recommend to others?
Thank you, Amanda, and thank you for the opportunity to be here. My goal is one day to present it in Spanish as well, so. Thank you, IDB, for allowing FinTrack to be on this panel with the esteemed panelist, Canada's FIU. Financial intelligence, it provides a unique window into the financial lives of criminals, which may demonstrate links that exist in someone's finances that are not easily observable through traditional law enforcement techniques. And this is the goal of financial intelligence, to provide, at first, is to corroborate some of the information that law enforcement may be aware of in regards to any criminal activities, but ultimately is to provide some leads and provide some intelligence that they were not aware of as well. It can identify linkages between individuals who may have little or no personal contact. In the case of human trafficking, and I will focus a little bit more on this predicate offense today, following the money may allow us to observe connections between recruiters, between handlers, and between perpetrators. Suspicious transaction reports that are due and are being reported to our agency in Canada at FinTrack, they are submitted by businesses, reporting entities such as banks, financial institutions, and are used by FinTrack to establish connections between individuals, between businesses and entities, and to develop actionable financial intelligence for disclosure recipients, being law enforcement or national security agencies. So financial intelligence may show links between individuals and businesses that have not been identified in an investigation, as I indicated before, but it helps investigators refine the scope and in their cases, in their investigations, and it provides possibly some shifts into different targets as well. So disclosure can pertain to an individual or a wider criminal network and can be used by law enforcement for affidavits, to obtain search warrants, and ultimately production orders. So we are providing intelligence to the law enforcement community partners, and they can proceed through production orders to get the evidence from the reporting entities such as banks, financial institutions, and so forth. So financial intelligence, it is black and white. The transactions did actually occur. This is not information that FIUs are coming up with. The reports are consistent, they're coming in. It is, in fact, intelligence that has occurred. It allows for a victim-centric story that can stand on its own. And this is what is important here, and I wanted to point out in regards to specific human trafficking related investigations. It is fact-based, and it does not require a victim testimony or additional steps, which can re-traumatize victims, which is particularly important with crimes targeting individuals, such as human trafficking. The more we work, the more work we do on these crimes, the larger sample we have of data to continue to develop new indicators. And this is what we ultimately, our ultimate goal is, to enlarge in the indicator capacity, new trends and new methods, specific crimes. It contributes to our strategic intelligence and provides for more focused and more tactical cases to law enforcement. A couple of final points that I wanted to make, and what underpinned the facilitated some of the specific cases is four things. One is the knowledge, and Mark had indicated earlier of some of the factors that are really important, is understanding by the reporting entities what are the indicators to look for and report accordingly to FIUs. Tagging reports to identify a priority area of focus, specifically what I indicated before, human trafficking. Skills and expertise for our analysts to identify relevant transactions and identify certain linkages. Number three, relations with partners to have a communication and exchanges of communication that are able to collaborate on priorities such as human trafficking. That is very important. And by wrapping up, I'd also say training and the knowledge and the understanding of police forces to make use and the best use of financial intelligence and how to further their investigations.
Thank you so much. Can you tell me what is FYU, though?
So FIU, Financial Intelligence Units.
Oh, FIU. Okay, great.
Yes.
Thank you. Sorry. I'm new to the acronym. Okay, let's go back to you, Rafael Espinosa. You've talked to us a little bit about the findings from the Regional Economic Outlook. Tell me why this issue was important for the IMF and for economic policymakers in general.
Yeah, we think the issue is important because it's going to affect directly fiscal policy, which is in the hands of economic policymakers, but also development policy more broadly, which finance ministers or development organizations are contributing to finance. So starting with fiscal policy, we know that when the issue becomes more important in countries, they tend to spend more. In the report that we published in October, we found out that even small increase in homicide rates leads to increase in spending in these areas. And the average level of spending is around 2% of GDP for countries in the region. So it's actually a substantial number, equivalent again to interventions in other areas such as public investment or educational systems. So the amounts are large, and we continue to work at the IMF on understanding the dynamics of this spending, because finance ministers, organizations like the IMF have to think about sustainability of fiscal policy as well. So it's important to understand when they are scaling up of this investment, of this spending in these areas, can they be scaled down? So this is the topic we're continuing to look at. The cost also sometimes have to be shared with the municipalities. As our fellow panelists were talking about, crime is local, it requires local interventions. So there's going to be thinking around the financial sharing of responsibilities between central governments and local governments. And all this relates to the fiscal decision that has to be made. Finally, there is a question of the efficiency of this spending, because we want to get the maximum security for the minimum cost. And this is an area that is very well suited to development partners such as the IDB, which is also working in this kind of area. So on top of that fiscal question, there is a development question which is broader, but that is financed by finance ministries with the help of development partners. And this development question, we realize involves policies beyond the narrow scope of security policy. There is a literature that says that economic factors such as unemployment, poverty, inequality are possible drivers of crime, and finance ministries have a responsibility to address this. Countercyclical fiscal policy can mitigate the effect of recessions, employment policies can reduce youth unemployment, social protection systems can reduce poverty. All of these are topics that are directly in the areas we look at and have a development mandate, but also implication for development for crimes. Even in the long run, the question of the education system and the state presence across the territory is also an important development question that will require finances. So overall, we think that these are very important topics for economic policymakers, given their magnitude, but also given the fact that a lot of the drivers of crime can be sometimes related to development outcomes and economic outcomes on which we have influence.
Yeah, excellent. Well, it's great to see it on the agenda, and we're glad that you're informing us with your analyses on public expenditure in this area. Renee, back to you. So we know that effective and legitimate police agencies are really important for public safety. And of course, police agencies in our region are undergoing reform processes. But at the same time, criminal organizations are also evolving and becoming more complex. So can you tell us a little bit about what you've found works in policing agencies to improve their legitimacy, to improve their effectiveness? Tell us more.
So what we know from the evidence base when it comes to legitimacy and effectiveness and for police reform, and America's also going through our own stage of police reform. And I think it really is an iterative process to have a healthy criminal justice organization. You're constantly evolving. And I think the base of what we know is for any type of healthy criminal justice system, you really need policing to be focused on preventative efforts for their communities and to build trust and legitimacy into the communities. One way to do that, police organizations have to really be accountable to their public. So having transparent data, right, to be able to show if you are making certain efforts, what are the outcomes of those efforts. So you really have to have a handful of things. One, your police officers themselves have to have the support, so they have to have the training to be able to engage with the community, be able to communicate well with the community, but also to do crime prevention practices that are good for the community and do follow-up investigation. So you have to build that infrastructure in there, and fundamentally, they will also need a living wage and benefits. We've seen across the US when there's different rates of pay for police officers, we lose them to other types of industries because they're not being paid well enough to, one, a lot of people will say, depending on where you work, oh, policing isn't really that dangerous, right? Because in the US, a lot of the calls we deal with isn't highly violent calls. But what you're actually dealing with is the stress of the day-to-day of the community, basically asking you to be out there policing and fixing their problems, whatever the problems are, and doing the follow-up investigations. So if you build the foundation of police reform on, we're going to build the support for our police officers internally, we're going to give them a living wage and benefits, we're going to give them the proper training so that they feel empowered to do the evidence-based practices in the field. And then we're also going to build systems of the data, because you have to have data across all your systems. Like I was saying before, you can't just take an intervention and plop it into your organization and say, okay, everything's fixed now. You actually have to have data that supports, okay, if the police are doing this, and then our prosecution office does this, and then here's what we're doing in the prisons, and then here's how we're following up. And I'm also leaving out your victims, your support for your community. You have to show how we are linking that all together and sharing information, both on a national and a local level. And the only way to do that is really having transparent data systems that communicate. And then the final piece of the evidence is really, once again, you're tracking what you're doing reactively, but you're also building your infrastructure at the same time. And you also have to have oversight. So that's the other piece of police reform. It's not just, you can't have a police organization that their only oversight is of themselves. What we found for any shift in American policing is that you have to have 3 layers to make that shift. You have to have policy change, Then you have to have the training to develop the policy, and then you have to have oversight to ensure that the policy and the training is being enacted out in the field in the way that you intended. And that is often where we see gaps. A policy gets created, there's a little bit of training, but then implementation, there's a failure there because we're not implementing it the way we intended. And I think there's technology now available that we can now share, and we're better at oversight. You know, there's body-worn cameras, there's CAD systems, there's rapid video response. There's lots of interventions you could do with technology. So I think it's wrapping that whole picture and really building the structure and the framework so that way you can continue it forever.
It's a journey. It's a journey. Okay, bueno, regresando a Jairo.
Now let's go back to Jairo. Could you tell us more about organized crime and the types of collaborative arrangements you need to have in place to take on this very complex challenge? I'd like to start with something Rafael mentioned, and it's making an efficient use of resources. We cannot have a city budget that allocates resources as if everyone was a criminal, but we also cannot stigmatize population groups because they are at risk. So we need to balance the budget exercise. Countries and cities have to understand that it is necessary to have each sector do its role. We need to have a good education system so that we don't have dropouts and we don't have organized crime that preys on those dropouts. We need to make sure that vulnerable sectors are not controlled by these forces. So I do think the private sector has a pivotal role to play. It has to be a beacon. It has to guide future citizens. We need to have training processes in place in order to help our youth. There has to be an ongoing connection with the private sector because it is the private sector that provides the opportunities that youth need, those who are working hard, who are studying, who are looking for a better future, so that they don't fall into the hands of the organized crime. Organized crime are not just a few armed bandits. These are organizations that start at the very grassroots level and become very sophisticated, as Vasilis was saying. Organized crime is not small business. It's not something that happens in neighborhoods. It's something that has an impact on the macroeconomy of our society. So it's important for the private sector to help us build portfolios, to have the resources to train our youth, to work in sectors that truly add value, not just give them a few classes here and there, teach them how to make ceramics. We need to offer them opportunities. They often feel constrained. Of course, the public sector has to be there to provide a holistic approach and provide a balanced budget that gives sense to economic development. But we need to work with others, with multilateral banks, for example, in order to have guidance, see where we're headed as societies, where our cities are going, because cities do play a key role. We've seen this with Natalie. When local authorities do not take on their role and fulfill their responsibilities, then violence wins and we lose. I'm sorry to say that currently in Latin America, we don't have the capacity, the know-how, and the pulse to understand all the implications of crime and violence in the region. We need to reposition local authorities with conversations at the national level and with evidence. It has to be new evidence, because if we look at our records, we find that they're increasingly constrained and face growing problems. And we miss having those private sector surveys. It's hard for the public sector to fund long-term surveys. We need robust surveys that are not simply limited to the government that is in power. We need to look to the future, and that's why we need to engage the private sector. It has to be more decisive. It has to understand that it has a responsibility in building a safer society. Society cannot withstand violence. It is something that breaks our society. So that's why we need to break this current situation. It's difficult, and to do that, we need to have candid conversations. Our youth is awaiting a more innovative response on the part of all of us, and it is a huge responsibility to have a conversation about potential sources of financing, long-term programs, and be able to achieve social and economic development. I invite you to come to Cali. This year, we will be hosting the Women's Soccer World Cup for the under-20 teams, and we're also going to be hosting a COP meeting. So I invite you to come to Cali so we can discuss violence prevention, discuss citizen security, talk about cities and their future and how they can help us reduce violence. Great, well, I guess we'll see each other in Cali. I would like to go back to Vasilius.
I think Project Protect, right, which is led by the Bank of Montreal and supported by Canadian law enforcement agencies, that targets financial flows that are related to human trafficking for sexual exploitation. As you said before, this is hugely profitable. The notes here say it generates $150 billion annually and is the third most lucrative for organized crime. And unfortunately, it's very prevalent in our region. So could you tell us a little bit about the lessons that you've learned through this project in terms of that collaboration between the public and private sectors? Heido also talked about this, and the strengthening of the capacities of law enforcement agencies.
Yes, and thank you for that question, and a great segue to what you shared as well, and the concerns around the world when it is specific to human trafficking. And I'm going to go back to what Mark had indicated at the beginning. It's the partnership of the stakeholders that really took Project Protect where it is today. It is the contribution of the public and the private NGOs, everybody getting together in one room and discussing the concerns of this specific offense and crime. Project Protect was launched back in 2016, already several years in the making, but it was one of the first, and we call it the flagship PPP in Canada, because it was inspired by a human trafficking survivor who got up and spoke at an AML conference, and she said, you know what, I have all these financial institutions here in the room, and Bank of Montreal actually was the one who took the lead, but every other bank as well in Canada has contributed to this project. But it was a call for action to say, what indicators are there in the financial world that can, feed the beast of the FIU, the Financial Intelligence Unit, and work collaboratively with other agencies and other, private sector and NGOs to really tackle this concern and human trafficking. So it took off in 2016. We've had 7 PPPs since. The latest one just released internationally was on wildlife, Project Anton. But it is the same model of a PPP where you have collectively stakeholders at the table discussing the predicate offense. And Project Protect is a focus on human trafficking. Over the past year, FINTRAC has provided over 560 disclosures of actionable financial intelligence to Canada's law enforcement agencies in relation to these 7 PPPs that we've done. So the lessons learned regarding collaboration through public-private partnerships, PPPs put a marker and a specific marker to the predicate offense that allows us to create a focal point, and let's begin with that, around which regime partners can discuss the vantage into our particular predicate offense and how financial intelligence can be developed and used going forward. It also gathers the experience and expertise and input from an array of partners like I discussed, particularly in the NGO community. It develops and customizes advice and guidance. and in the form of an operational alert, which we have too under Project Protect, and indicators, which are very important, not only to educate the banks of the indicators that are there and surface these transactions that are suspicious to get out to the financial intelligence units, but to also provide this to the law enforcement community, the indicators that they can work with to actually target this specific crime. And to streamline reports analysis through a hashtag. So we do use hashtags to be able to surface these transactions. Example, hashtag protect would go to our human trafficking team at the FIU to be able to be more timely in the disclosure of financial intelligence. And lastly is to create a buyer for our financial product and intelligence, particularly as it pertains to the proactive work that we do. So we do work reactively on ongoing investigations, but we have the capability to take these transactions we get from the financial institutions and work proactively and identify who best within the law enforcement community could receive these transactions and action them. So the contribution to the awareness campaign, which can be particularly valuable for crimes such as fraud or human trafficking, and while typically a behind-the-scenes operation, PPPs, public-private partnerships, they generate public and media attention. Externally, public awareness ties into broader strategy and objectives of prevention and deterrence. And this is the focus, to recognize the signs of the crime and to be able to better identify and detect. Internally, within the AML regime, it also creates a rallying point around which we can structure presentations, training, and bring together stakeholders, as Mark had indicated right up front, to comprehensively respond to these crimes. So, I mean, one final message that I can leave with the audience here is this is a model that Canada has adopted. It has been very successful. We are now not only working and speaking to it domestically, but internationally, of how stakeholders can get together, government agencies, private sector, NGOs. Let's all bring the issues forward, have that discussion. It starts with a discussion, and we're able to see some results.
Excellent. And I'm glad that you ended with how much we can work together across borders, because this is a problem that, of course, crosses borders and faces all of us. So finally, we'll go to you, Natalie. Tell us a little bit about cómo se entiende el banco este tema.
How does the bank understand this issue, how we're working with countries in the region, and what the plans for the future are? Well, thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. I would like to thank my fellow panelists and the audience as well for being here. Yes, the citizen security and justice agenda at the bank comes from a recognition of the impact that crime and violence has on development. This is something that we have heard come through very loudly. There is no aspect in life, and that goes for development as well, that isn't affected by crime and violence. At the bank, this is an agenda that was launched. We have been working hand in hand with the different countries, always working evidence-based. In using the information we've gotten from countries, we have learned a great deal. We have also become experts in our interventions, and we have also contributed to strategic partnerships to do the kind of work that, as was said here, requires these kinds of partnerships. Before getting to the answer to the question regarding what the bank does in the face of complex challenges like organized crime, I think that one thing that has been said is that organized crime is a significant factor in all of the violence we see occurring in our region. It's important to note that. I think the fact that it is behind 50% of homicides in the region, between 20 and 50% of households in Latin America are afraid. They feel that they are threatened by criminal organizations. This is something that should really draw our attention to addressing this issue. Now, why has this been growing, and why is it that organized crime has become so strong? We've gotten different aspects of that answer from our panelists. This is a complex challenge. It can also involve diversity of crimes and bring together a lot of different risk factors. Some were already mentioned, and many of them are systemic in our region. For example, the lack of socioeconomic opportunities, weak institutions, and individual and community factors that also contribute to it. People who experience violence in their households and who grew up around it, that all contributes to a growing and strengthening of organized crime. Now, these risk factors, as well as the business opportunities for these criminal actors that are very profitable, that is why these groups come to be and eventually grow in strength. Now, think about a criminal organization that pretty much operates like a legal business. They are looking for the same targets. They want to grow, they want to better leverage other illegal markets. In many cases, we see a lot of partnerships. Sometimes they actually absorb other partners to become more powerful, and they have incredible lobbying strength and power for influencing public policy. And all of this helps to expand. Now, what instruments do they use? That's what we just heard. Corruption, violence, and in the most critical cases, what the Secretary for Kali mentioned, criminal governance. I do think it's important to understand what can be done and be aware of what the risk factors are. We need to think about how these criminal enterprises work. That allows us to have that entry point and learn how to address this in a different way, come from a different angle. And as Mark mentioned, how to be more strategic. This is where I believe that the bank, through its different departments and the areas it works in, and building on the experience that we have had, has led to actually recommending an approach to take on organized crime that is based on 3 goals. I'll name them briefly, but they're fairly well aligned with what we have been discussing and thinking as part of the team. The first is to understand the overall context. I think that beyond just looking at criminal organization as statistics, how many homicides, how many kidnappings, is actually knowing what it means. Listen to communities, understand which communities have a higher risk, or the communities that have already been overrun by organized crime, what the risk factors are. Also, understand the ecosystem of these illegal economies, what the markets are, how they work, how they operate, what the revenue is, what the different structures are. And these are the important mechanisms that can go beyond just the stats that we all know today. That's one of the pillars we want to focus our work on. The second is reducing profitability and business opportunities of these different groups in their illegal work. There's an opportunity to build more capacity in a more specific way, a more specialized way. This is something we heard today on the panel. There are cost and labor dimensions to organized crime. Now, what does that mean? It means that we can be investing in education and in work opportunities for young people, which builds resilience against being recruited. Also, make sure that criminal organizations find it more costly to operate. So we can increase highly specialized intelligence capabilities and criminal investigation capabilities. And of course, to implement mechanisms so that there can be more strong action taken against money laundering, reducing the influence and violence perpetrated by organized criminal enterprises is also a key aspect of this fight, and ensure that the institutions are solid as well and can't be co-opted by organized crime. There are a number of things being tried already in Latin America. There, for example, is targeted deterrence is what the approach is called, and that is to focus on the crimes that have the highest impact. We're talking about extortion and murders. The last point is a nonviolent conflict resolution approach, which is absolutely key in reducing the levels of violence and finding ways in society for there to be more coexistence and a more peaceful environment. And so the way we see it, taking on organized crime requires strategic approaches and especially building partnerships. The panel we have here today, I think, is a good reflection of that. We need to continue to invest in understanding what the impact is and deepening that understanding, how to be more efficient in using resources in the public safety and security sector so that there can be more resources available for some of the other activities. We need to also understand the local governments and what they're saying, what they need, and of course PPPs, which are vital in this partnership. I think together we can both improve lives but also save lives. Thank you. Thank you very much, Natalie. And thank you all, Rafael, Renee, Jairo, and Vasilios, of course. Thank you all very much for being with us for this panel. We are now going to wrap up our discussion, and we are going to play a video that shows what the IDB has done in this area. With that, we end our panel. Thank you all very much, and thank you to the audience.
América Latina y el Caribe enfrentan.
Latin America and the Caribbean are facing a safety and security crisis that is characterized by the emerging challenges posed by organized crime. Against this backdrop, citizen security is absolutely key in addressing growing crime, violence, and lack of public safety to drive economic development and growth in the region. Citizen security is a key part of the development agenda for the IDB Group. We are a multilateral organization that is at the forefront of building institutional capacity and promoting public policies that are based on evidence in the security and justice sector in the region. Between 2009 and 2023, we approved 38 loans representing $1.6 billion in loans in 15 different countries. The goal was to develop violence prevention policies that focus on poor and vulnerable populations, to strengthen reporting mechanisms and reintegration for victims, building capacity for law enforcement and justice agencies, and promoting more specialization in addressing complex challenges like human trafficking, cybercrime, and money laundering. Also making it easier to gain access to law enforcement and justice services, and strengthening the penitentiary systems and social reintegration policies. That has led to cutting-edge knowledge generated and also a big push in what is happening in the cyberspace. We have created policy dialogue and knowledge forums like Knowledge Week and also strategic partnerships. The complexity that we see in how robust this crime is requires that we work across sectors. The IDB is a go-to partner for creating impactful partnerships and cross-fertilization of knowledge in a way that leads to scalable operations that improve lives in Latin America and the Caribbean. Learn more about our work and join us as we build a more fair, safe, and equitable society.
Muchas gracias a nuestro.
I'd like to thank our panelists for their remarks. This brings us to the end of this seminar. We thank everyone who has participated here in the room and who is watching this the live stream. In the Santa Fe room, you have a special lunch for you, and we'll come back to this very room at 1:30. That is when we will begin our next seminar. Enjoy your meal.